Today, we're looking at 3 more skeletons: the Skeletal Crossbowman, the Skeletal Mage, and the Skeleton Champion. In my original skeleton revision, I wanted to make the basic skeleton feel more like a skeleton. Not just a weak, undead archer, but a creature that could collapse into a pile of bones, hide in plain sight, and eventually reassemble unless the party destroyed it properly. That version gave skeletons a stronger identity. They were not durable in the same way zombies are durable. Zombies keep standing because their bodies refuse to stop moving. Skeletons keep coming back because breaking them apart is not always enough. So, for these 3 stat blocks, I wanted to build on that idea. These are not meant to replace the base skeleton. They are meant to expand it. The basic skeleton is the common foot soldier. These are the specialists. The crossbowman gives skeletons a defensive ranged unit. The mage gives them magical support. And the champion gives them a proper frontline commander or elite guard. Together, they let you build a much more interesting undead encounter without needing to jump straight to wights, death knights, or liches. You can still have a fight that is mostly skeletons, but now those skeletons actually have roles. And that is the big goal here. I do not want every skeleton to feel like the same creature with a different weapon. I want the players to look at the battlefield and think that one needs to be stopped, that one is supporting the others, and that one is holding the line. So, let's start with the Skeletal Crossbowman. This is a CR2 medium undead with an armor class of 16 from breastplate, 26 hit points, and a speed of 30 feet. Right away, this is not exactly a basic skeleton with a crossbow. The armor class is slightly higher, the hit points are doubled, and the main weapon is heavier. The basic skeleton is fragile. It is dangerous when ignored, but it can be dropped pretty quickly if the party focuses on it. The Skeletal Crossbowman is meant to be harder to remove. It is a fortified ranged unit. This is the kind of skeleton I imagine standing behind a barricade, guarding a ruined castle's wall, defending a crypt hallway, or serving as an undead sniper in a necromancer's army. It still has classic skeleton characteristics such as vulnerability to bludgeoning damage and immunity to poison damage. You have the standard undead creature kit with dark vision for 60 feet and immunity to exhaustion and poisoned, though yes, I know not every undead has those traits. It also keeps the 2 core traits from my revised skeleton that I covered in a previous video, Pylobones and Skeletal Fortitude. I'll do a small review of the abilities for those that weren't here last time. Pylobones lets the skeleton disassemble itself into an ordinary pile of bones as a bonus action. While disassembled, it can still perceive its surroundings, but it cannot act except to reassemble itself. It also gains resistance to piercing and slashing damage while disassembled. And importantly, it can use this ability as a reaction when it takes damage, but if it does, it needs to use an action to reassemble instead of a bonus action. This trait is one of the main reasons I like these skeletons. It gives them a very different kind of defense. They are not just tanky. They are evasive in a weird, undead way. A skeleton can suddenly collapse, blend in with other bones, and force the party to question whether that pile of remains is actually dead. That is exactly the kind of behavior I want from skeletons. Then there is Skeletal Fortitude. If damage reduces the skeleton to 0 hit points, but does not kill it outright, the skeleton reassembles in 1d4 days unless the damage is radiant or from a critical hit. That means destroying the skeleton in the moment is not always the same thing as permanently destroying it. Again, this does not make the skeleton unbeatable. It just makes it feel more undead. It makes radiant damage and critical hits matter more. And it gives the DM a way to have skeletons return later if the party does not deal with them properly. Now, for the crossbowman's actions. Its main attack is the heavy crossbow. It has a +5 to hit, a range of 100/400 feet, and deals 1d10 plus 3 piercing damage. That is simple, but effective. This thing is not trying to be flashy every single turn. It is a ranged threat with a solid weapon and strong positioning. It also has a short sword for when creatures get close. But honestly, that is not where this skeleton wants to be. The crossbowman wants distance, cover, and a good line of sight. And that is where Deploy Pavis comes in. As an action, the skeleton plants the heavy shield carried on its back in an unoccupied space within 5 feet of itself. The shield occupies a 5-foot line within the space. Creatures within 10 feet directly behind the shield have 3/4 cover against attacks and effects originating from the opposite side. The skeleton can also use an action to retrieve the shield. The shield has an armor class of 10, 45 hit points, and immunity to poison and psychic damage. This is what makes the crossbowman more than just skeleton with bigger crossbow. It creates cover. It changes the battlefield. You can put this skeleton in a hallway, on a bridge, in a ruined courtyard, or behind a line of zombies, and suddenly it can establish a little defensive position. 3/4 cover is a big deal. It gives a creature a +5 bonus to AC and Dexterity, saving throws against effects coming from the other side. So if the skeleton deploys its pavis and starts firing from behind it, the party now has a choice. Do they try to shoot through the cover? Do they flank it? Do they destroy or bypass the shield? Do they rush the skeleton and risk whatever is guarding it? That is good encounter design in my opinion. A monster does not need a giant list of abilities to be interesting. Sometimes one simple battlefield tool is enough. This also reinforces the military feel of the creature. A pavis crossbowman immediately feels different from a normal archer. It is not a skirmisher running around the battlefield doing hit and runs. It is establishing a firing position. It is creating a defensive line. And because this is a skeleton, you can imagine it standing there for decades, still holding the same position it held in life, waiting for something to enter its line of fire. Then it has Susur Bolt. 3 times per day, on a recharge of 5 to 6, the skeleton makes a heavy crossbow attack. On a hit, the target must make a DC 14 Constitution saving throw or be under the effects of the silent spell until the start of the skeleton's next turn. The bolt loses its magical properties whether the attack hits or misses. This is a very cool feature that I borrowed from Baldur's Gate 3. It gives the crossbowman a specific anti-caster role. It does not just deal more damage. It disrupts spellcasting. That matters because if this skeleton is part of an undead formation, it can target the wizard, cleric, bard, or sorcerer and potentially shut off verbal components for a round. That is nasty. It also gives the DM a reason to prioritize targets intelligently. A normal skeleton might shoot whoever is closest. A skeletal crossbowman with Susur bolts should be aiming at spellcasters. That makes it feel trained. It makes it feel purposeful, and it makes the players care about it immediately. The moment the wizard gets hit and suddenly cannot cast verbal spells, the party is going to understand what that skeleton does. Now, I had initially not had it on recharge and just had it to 3 per day, but I quickly realized that having multiple of these out at the same time would be too broken if the party is low on spellcasters and the DM decides to hard target the one caster the party has with all of the crossbowmen. I figured having it on a recharge would make it more balanced. Please leave a comment below if you have anything to say about this ability. Anyways, that is exactly what a specialist monster should do. You should be able to understand its role through play, not after reading 6 paragraphs, not after checking 5 conditions. One hit tells the players, that skeleton is a problem. So overall, the Skeletal Crossbowman is a defensive range specialist. It creates cover, pressures targets from a distance, and can temporarily silence enemy spellcasters. It is perfect for undead fortifications, castle walls, crypt defenses, or any encounter where you want skeletons to feel like organized soldiers rather than random animated bones. Next, let's talk about the Skeletal Mage. This is a CR3 medium undead with armor class 15 from Mage Armor, 32 hit points, and a speed of 30 feet. It has lower strength, decent dexterity and constitution, and an intelligence of 16. That intelligence matters because this skeleton is not just a corpse holding a staff. This is what remains of a spellcaster. Maybe it was a court mage. Maybe it was a necromancer's apprentice. Maybe it was a battlefield arcanist. Maybe it was someone whose magic was bound into their bones after death. Whatever the story is, this skeleton fills a very different role from the crossbowman. The crossbowman is about ranged weapon pressure and battlefield cover. The Skeletal Mage is about magical support and disruption. It has Arcana proficiency, which is a nice touch. It also understands Common plus 2 other languages, but cannot speak. I like that detail because it can understand orders, read magical writing, and recognize arcane symbols, but it is still silent. It has enough awareness to use magic intelligently, but it is still trapped in that voiceless skeletal state. Mechanically, it also keeps pylo bones and skeletal fortitude. That means even the mage can collapse into bones and potentially return later unless destroyed properly. That is important because it keeps all these skeletons connected to the same base identity. They all have different jobs, but they are still skeletons. Now, the main thing here is spellcasting. The Skeletal Mage uses intelligence as its spellcasting ability, with a spell save DC of 13 and a +5 to hit with spell attacks. It casts its spells without material or verbal components, which is pretty standard for most monster casters, aside from the lack of verbal components. At will, it has Mage Hand, Ray of Frost, and Toll the Dead. 3 times per day, it has Magic Missile, Shield, and Tasha's Hideous Laughter. 2 times per day, it has Darkbolt and Thunderwave. And once per day, it has Counterspell. I like this because it feels less like a generic low-level wizard and more like a specific undead support caster. It still has damage, it still has defense, and it still has control, but the list is tight. It does not need a huge pile of spells to work, especially since it's not intended to be an all-powerful spellcaster. It just needs enough tools to make the battlefield a bit more complicated. The at-will spells give it reliable options. Ray of Frost lets it slow something down, Toll the Dead gives it a necromantic damage option, and Mage Hand is mostly for flavor, but gives it a little utility. Magic Missile gives it guaranteed damage when it needs to finish someone off or force concentration checks. Shield keeps it alive. Tasha's Hideous Laughter gives it a disabling option. Thunderwave gives it an emergency button if melee characters get too close. Darkbolt is also a nice fit here, since it throws multiple rays of darkness and can prevent a target from using reactions if they fail their Constitution save. It gives the Skeletal Mage a very clear disruption role. It can help open space for other undead, make it harder for enemies to punish movement, and support a larger undead formation without just dealing raw damage. Counterspell being once per day also feels right. It gives the mage one important magical answer, but it does not let it constantly shut down the party spellcasters. That keeps it threatening without making it obnoxious. When the Skeletal Mage uses Counterspell, it should feel like a meaningful moment, not something it does every round. That is the role I want from this creature. The Skeletal Mage does not need to be a lich, and it does not need to be a full wizard. It is a support piece. If the party ignores it, it can throw out damage, control, or disruption. If the party spellcaster tries to do something important, it might stop them once. If the fighter closes in, it can use Shield or Thunderwave to survive a little longer. That makes it a target priority problem. A group of basic skeletons and zombies is one thing. A group of skeletons and zombies with a skeletal mage behind them is another. Now the party has to decide whether they focus the front line, the ranged attackers, or the caster supporting them. The skeletal mage's weapon attack is just a quarterstaff. It is not impressive, and it shouldn't be. This creature is not supposed to be in melee. If it is swinging a quarterstaff, something has probably gone terribly wrong for it. But that is fine. Not every monster needs to be equally good at every range. Its weakness is part of its role. The skeletal mage wants to stay behind defenders, use cover, and cast spells while other undead keep enemies away from it. And because it is still a skeleton, it can use pylo bones to collapse and potentially avoid some damage or set up an ambush. I really like the image of a skeletal mage as a harmless-looking pile of bones in an old laboratory, surrounded by broken glass and rotted books. The party steps inside. The bones start assembling. Pale light burns in the eye sockets. A spellbook opens in its hands. And suddenly the room is not empty anymore. So the skeletal mage is your magical support specialist. It is not meant to replace a lich or a necromancer. It is much lower level than that. But it gives skeleton encounters access to spellcasting without immediately escalating to a major undead villain. Finally, we have the Skeleton Champion. This is a CR5 medium undead with armor class 18 from breastplate and shield, 85 hit points, and a speed of 30 feet. This is the elite. This is the skeleton that used to be someone important. A knight, a captain, a warlord, a champion, something more than a nameless corpse. Its strength is 16, its constitution is 18, and it has proficiency in strength and constitution saving throws. That already tells you what kind of role it fills. Unlike the crossbowman or mage, the skeleton champion is actually trying to head for the front line. It has good armor, solid hit points, strong saving throws, and a set of attacks that let it fight at both melee and a small range. It still has the same skeleton traits: bludgeoning vulnerability, poison immunity, exhaustion and poisoned immunity, dark vision, and of course, it still has pylo bones and skeletal fortitude. That means even this elite champion can collapse into bones and potentially return later if not properly destroyed. That is important because it makes the skeleton champion feel like the perfected version of the skeleton concept. It is not just hard to kill because it has hit points and armor. It is hard to truly get rid of because it is still a skeleton. Now, its main action is multi-attack. The skeleton makes 2 attacks, using longsword or javelin in any combination. It can replace 1 attack with shield bash. That gives it a very flexible turn. It can fight in melee or throw javelins. It can knock enemies prone and adapt depending on where it is standing. The javelin is nice because it can be used in melee or at range, though the intent is for it to only be used at range. It has a +6 to hit and deals 2d6 plus 3 piercing damage, whether used in melee or thrown. That is stronger than a normal javelin, and that is fine. This is not a random skeleton with a rusty spear. This is a champion. It should hit harder. A lot of monsters hit harder than a player would with a normal weapon anyways. The longsword is its main melee weapon. It has a +6 to hit and deals 2d10 plus 3 slashing damage. And if the attack hits, the target has disadvantage on the next attack roll it makes before the start of the skeleton's next turn. It's basically just the longsword's sap mastery pasted onto the block. I like it because it represents the champion's martial skill. The sword strike does not just hurt you. It throws you off balance and disrupts your stance, making your next attack worse. Mechanically, this helps the champion survive and protect other undead around it. If it hits the fighter's next attack is less reliable. If it hits the rogues can't use sneak attack. If it hits a paladin, maybe that big smite misses. That is very fitting for an elite undead warrior. Then we have shield bash. This is a melee attack that deals bludgeoning damage, and if the target is large or smaller, it knocks them prone. This gives the champion a control option similar to Iudex's Kick, the previous monster I discussed on this channel, but on a much lower CR creature. It can knock someone down, then follow up with another attack or let other undead exploit the prone target. And because the champion can replace 1 attack with shield bash, it has options. It can shield bash first, knock the target prone, then attack with advantage using the longsword. Or it can attack with its longsword or javelins twice, focusing on pure DPR. Then, under reactions, it has parry. When the skeleton or a creature within 5 feet of it is hit by a melee attack roll while the skeleton is holding a weapon, it adds 2 to the target's AC against that attack, potentially causing it to miss. This is another great feature. It makes the skeleton champion feel like a guard, not just a damage dealer or brute, but a protector. It can defend itself, but it can also defend nearby allies. That gives it a battlefield role. Put this thing next to a skeletal mage, and suddenly the mage is harder to kill. Put it next to a necromancer, and now the necromancer has a bodyguard. Put it at the front of a hallway, and it becomes a real obstacle. This is exactly what I want from a skeleton champion. It should feel like the elite martial undead that stands between the party and the thing they actually want to reach. It is a duelist, a guard, and a commander all in one. Now, when you look at these 3 skeletons together, the roles become very clear. The Skeletal Crossbowman controls lines of sight and pressures enemies from range. The Skeletal Mage adds spellcasting, disruption, and magical support. The Skeleton Champion holds the front line, knocks enemies down, and protects nearby allies. That is a much more interesting skeleton encounter than just 4 skeletons with crossbows. And the important part is that they still all feel like skeletons. They all share the same underlying undead identity. They are vulnerable to bludgeoning and immune to poison. They can collapse into piles of bones, and unless destroyed properly, they can reassemble later. That shared identity ties them together, but their individual mechanics give them different battlefield roles. That is exactly how I like monster variants to work. The base creature gives you the foundation. The variants change how that foundation is used. A skeletal crossbowman is still a skeleton, but it uses that skeleton identity to create a defensive firing position. A skeletal mage is still a skeleton, but it uses that identity to become a magical support piece. A skeleton champion is still a skeleton, but it uses that identity to become an elite martial threat. None of them need to be overloaded with mechanics. They just need one or two clear reasons to exist. Now, let's talk about how I would actually use them. For a lower level encounter, you could use one skeletal crossbowman with a few basic skeletons. Put the crossbowman behind its pavis and let the other skeletons screen for it. The party now has to deal with a ranged enemy that is harder to hit and can potentially silence a spellcaster. That is a simple encounter, but it already has more going on than a normal skeleton fight. For a slightly tougher encounter, add the Skeletal Mage. Now the party has ranged weapon pressure and magical support. The crossbowman threatens casters with Susur Bolt. The mage threatens the party with Counterspell, Magic Missile, Tasha's Hideous Laughter, or Thunderwave. The basic skeletons or zombies keep the front line occupied. That kind of encounter gives the players real decisions. Do they rush the mage? Do they deal with the crossbowman? Do they clear the front line first? Do they risk ignoring the skeletons and go straight for the support? Then, for a more serious fight, add the skeleton champion. The champion stands in front, protecting the mage or crossbowman. It uses shield bash to knock enemies prone. It uses longsword to weaken enemy attacks. It uses parry to protect itself or nearby allies. Now the party has to break through a real undead formation. That is where these monsters shine. They are not just individual stat blocks. They are encounter pieces. The champion protects. The crossbowman pressures. The mage disrupts. And the basic skeletons fill the battlefield. That gives you a full undead squad. You can also use these as the remains of an old military unit. Maybe the crossbowmen are still guarding a ruined wall. Maybe the mage was once the company's battlecaster. Maybe the champion was their captain. Maybe they are still following their last orders centuries after death. That is the kind of flavor that makes skeletons work really well. They do not need to be mindless in the same way zombies are. They can be repetitive, disciplined, and eerie. They can still stand guard or march in formation. They can still defend a place that no longer matters. And because they cannot speak, there is something especially creepy about them doing all of this silently. No war cries, no commands, no breathing, just bones moving into position, a shield slamming into the ground, a crossbow being raised, a mage's eye sockets lighting up, a champion drawing its sword. That is the vibe I want from these creatures. So overall, these three skeletons are meant to make skeleton encounters more varied without losing the core identity of the creature. The Skeletal Crossbowman gives you a fortified ranged attacker. The Skeletal Mage gives you arcane support. The Skeleton Champion gives you an elite frontline defender. Together, they make skeletons feel less like disposable low-level enemies and more like the remains of an army. And that is what I like most about them. A zombie horde should feel like a mass of bodies. But a skeleton force should feel organized, cold, disciplined, still following orders long after death. These stat blocks help sell that. They turn skeletons from simple archers into an undead fighting force with roles, tactics, and battlefield presence. And for me, that is exactly where skeletons are most interesting. Not as random bones with bows, but as the silent remains of soldiers who never stopped guarding their post. If you enjoyed today's video, please consider leaving a like and subscribe to see future content. I look forward to sharing many more creatures that I've made over the past couple of years. I'm probably at around 185 or maybe even 200 creatures made by this point. I really enjoy homebrewing and sharing it with others. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful day.